2813 Exile Army. Morgan's arrival bought them more time. The staunchest loyalists of the old domains, most of them former retainers of Clan Valor, had been exiled to Godgrave, where they spent their days keeping the Scarlet Jungle away from the Road of Shadows. Theirs was a stark and austere life, full of nothing but endless strife and a lingering taste of defeat. There were not too many of them, but also not too few. More importantly, those most loyal were usually the most dedicated. So, many of the exiles were the core of the great Clan Valor's forces in the past. Seasoned knights who had subjugated the northern reaches of the Dream Realm with anvil and mattock, scores of promising squires, and several saints, as well. Saint Jest of Clan Dagonet and Saint Gilead, the Summer Knight, were the most powerful of them. Not only were they powerful, but Jest was greatly adept at playing with the enemy's mind. Against an adversary like Mordred, whose single consciousness controlled countless vessels, such an aspect was especially potent. Gilead's aspect, meanwhile, granted him great affinity to nature and its elements, including water. There was a reason why he had been called the guardian of Mirror Lake in the past. Now, the same power that had made him the champion of Bastion could help the Hum-An domain in defending the Lake of Tears. The problem, naturally, was that neither of them was a subject of the human domain. They and the rest of the exiles had already refused to submit to Changing Star, so there was no reason for them to join the fight against either Mordred or Astarion. In fact, many of them were prime candidates to become thralls of the Hunger domain. That was why Morgan had ventured into the hollows of Godgrave to meet the exiles and convince them to join the fight against Mordred. It had not been a given that she would succeed, but just like Seishan was the former princess of song, Morgan was the former princess of valor, the princess of war. So, if anyone could convince the embittered exiles to put their lives on the line for the woman who had usurped the thrones of their monarchs, it was her. And she had. At the break of dawn, the small but powerful outcast army descended from the edges of the Moonriver Plains to join the battle against the King of Nothing. Of course, these powers were not enough to shatter the will of a sovereign, but they could at least serve as a persistent distraction. The rest of the exiles reinforced the reeling forces of the human domain. And, naturally, there was Morgan herself. She alone was one of the deadliest transcendent warriors in the world, competing for the first place with people like Nightingale, Raised by Wolves, Soul Reaper Jet, Nightwalker, and Seishan herself. So, when she joined the battle against her monstrous brother, the effect was both visible and immediate. The battles beneath and above the Weeping Goddess were still frenzied and precarious, but The Citadel itself, at least, was firmly in the hands of its defenders once more. Out there on the walls of the fortress that clung to the cliffs, Morgan coalesced into her human form. The battlements around her were like a scene from hell, painted entirely red and littered by unrecognizable pieces of shredded flesh as far as the eye could see. Those were the remains of countless vessels she had sliced apart as her transcendent form washed over the walls and aerial bridges of the citadel. The scarlet blood suited the vibrant color of her vermilion eyes quite well. Looking around with a cold expression, she walked across the morbid carpet of rent flesh and offered her gloved hand to Beastmaster, who was kneeling in a small island of clean stone. Pulling her to her feet, Morgan gazed down upon the battlefield. Her expression darkened. Beastmaster, who had once commanded the Song army against Morgan in the Battle of the Black Skull, gave the former princess a smile. Her smile was exquisite and enchanting despite the blood and grime covering the mesmerizing canvas of her beautiful face. "We're doing quite well, aren't we?" Morgan pursed her lips. "We're not." She lingered for a moment and then pointed at the vast sea of vessels below. "Can't you see? Most of these vessels are of modest ranks, with relatively few great abominations participating in the fight. His reflections are nowhere to be seen, either." Beastmaster sighed, then chuckled bitterly. "So, he's holding back on us." Morgan gave her a somber look. "Of course he is. We are not even his enemy, after all. We are simply the obstacle on the road to facing the true enemy. So, he's saving the best of his forces for later." Beastmaster's smile faltered. Saving the best for later. Mordred's worst was already enough to make the strongest warriors of the human domain feel despair. The gap between saints and supremes was simply that vast, and he was not just any supreme, at that. Just like Changing Star and the Lord of Shadows, he had clawed his way to supremacy by relying only on his own strength, without the support of the spell. In that regard, Mordred was perhaps more dangerous than Astarion. The worst thing about him, however, was that he was not interested in preserving anyone's lives. The Dreamspawn wanted to spare as many people as possible to devour them later, so he had not caused grave losses to humanity yet. Mordred, however, was the opposite. If anything, it was beneficial to him to kill as many of them as possible, so that Astarion could not add their strength to his domain. So, the losses the human domain had suffered in this one battle were more grave than all the deaths caused by the spread of the hunger domain thus far, combined. It was enough to start questioning who the real enemy was. And who wasn't an enemy at all. Come to your senses. Morgan's shout made Beastmaster flinch and shake off her momentary reverie. What had she been thinking about? The battle must go on. Command your thralls to defend the gateway and do not let my brother get to it, no matter what. Beastmaster nodded. That was what I've been doing, anyway. What about you? Morgan gazed upon the Lake of Tears, which looked black in the bleak light of early dawn due to all the blood mixing with its waters. I'm going down. He is my brother. After all, we have a tradition of trying to kill each other every time we meet, so I ought to give him the opportunity to finish me off today, as well. Her scarlet eyes glowed with cold sharpness. And who knows, maybe I'll be lucky enough to chop his head off, instead. 2814 Second Sunset. The reinforcements Morgan had brought helped the defenders of the Lake of Tears buy the civilians more time to flee toward Ravenheart. They might not have lasted 2 days, as Nightingale had hoped for, but the ferocious battle did rage on throughout the morning and well past noon, almost reaching its second sunset. In the end, however, it was all pointless. Even while holding his best chess pieces back and spread thin across 3 battlefronts, Moonriver Plains, Glass Hell, and Chained Isles, Mordred still crushed them. The Saints had exhausted their essence. The Ascended were riddled with wounds and losing all hope. The awakened warriors suffered grievous losses, dying in scores despite the blessing of their goddess. Seishan had managed to keep herself alive, but many of her sisters would have been dead if not for Nephis. She witnessed Deathsinger and Lonesome Howl receive wounds that would have been fatal if not for the miraculous white flames of their sovereign. She saw a young saint who had only recently conquered his 3rd nightmare fall, never to rise again. Just like that, humanity lost one of its transcendent champions. It was Godgrave, all over again. No, it was much worse than that. Her mother and the King of Swords had committed myriad sins, true, but their goals, misguided as They might have been, had always been altruistic. They wanted to preserve as many human lives as could be saved, according to their cold logic, by sacrificing everyone else. The war they waged upon each other was meant to give humanity a chance to survive. The true cause of this ferocious slaughter, though, was Astarion, a man who wanted to devour all of mankind. The perpetrator of the slaughter, meanwhile, was Mordred, who wanted to eradicate as many humans as possible to rob Astarion of excess power. Neither of them was aiming to save anyone except himself, which made this battle feel far more malicious than anything that had happened in Godgrave. In fact, what these 2 supreme horrors were doing felt more malevolent than even the atrocities committed by nightmare creatures. Nightmare creatures, after all, did not possess concepts of good and evil, moral and immoral. But Astarion and Mordred did, and chose to be no better than nightmare creatures anyway. For the first time since becoming an awakened, Seishan felt nauseated by the stench of blood. I want to be a supreme, too. She wanted to become as powerful as they were, so that she could bleed them and rend them apart, so that she could erase their vile presence from existence. The battle was quickly barreling toward a breaking point. The battered formation of the defending army beneath the Weeping Goddess was about to collapse, and the warriors fighting atop the great waterfall had been pushed to the very edge of the cliffs, mere steps away from plummeting down. Only the citadel itself still held, stubbornly refusing to be conquered by the King of Nothing. At some point, Seishan found herself fighting side by side with Nightingale once again. We can't continue. Her voice was hoarse. We must abandon the remaining civilians and retreat. He glanced at her, his eyes betraying a sense of anguish, fear, and fury. Not yet. Seishan gritted her teeth. If you don't command a retreat, you'll lose both the civilians and the soldiers. She pierced him with a scathing gaze, wondering if the man who had conquered Ravenheart without spilling a single drop of blood was truly worthy of ruling it. This is your burden. Carry it. Kai's expression tensed. He glanced over the battlefield, his mystical eyes seeing every little detail with flawless clarity. He saw the city and the people who were frantically waiting for the enormous elevators to take them to the top of the plateau, or scaling the endless expanse of stairs carved into the stone, as well. Kai's task was to court these people as they escaped The Lake of Tears, and to defend them on the road to Ravenheart, too. What do I do? Somewhere else on the battlefield, Morgan was ignoring the taunting voices of her brother as she calmly and methodically cut down one vessel after another. Kai should be sounding the retreat soon. If nothing happened to change the flow of the battle before that. Her thoughts were grim. She knew that Kai, as the steward of the West, would want to protect every single one of his people. No, even if he was not their ruler, he would have wanted to save them regardless. But what they needed to be protected from was not becoming vessels of the King of Nothing. Mordred did not really need thousands more mundane vessels. Taking the bodies of these people was not going to add much to his strength. He simply aimed to kill them all to diminish the future hunger domain. What he really wanted was the citadel itself, which would grant him far greater power. More important than even the citadel was access to the River of Tears. That was a far more important prize. Because both the River of Tears itself and the lands surrounding it were home to myriad nightmare creatures. It was these nightmare creatures that were his real goal, the true resource that could vastly empower his domain. In that regard, the true goal that Mordred pursued must have always been Godgrave. After all, the Scarlet Jungle of Godgrave possessed a unique ability to give birth to nightmare creatures at a rate impossible anywhere else in the Dream Realm. These nightmare creatures grew and climbed to higher ranks with astonishing speed, as well. In short, Godgrave was a lavish and nearly inexhaustible source of new vessels for Mordred, who desperately needed to match Astarion's growth. The Glass Hell was merely the staging ground for his invasion of Godgrave, while the attacks on the Lake of Tears and the Chained Isles were secondary goals at best, and nothing more than distractions at worst. There was one citadel in the Glass Hell. There was one citadel on the edge of the Moonriver Plains, as well, and while there used to be two citadels on the Chained Isles, only one of them was left. Godgrave, however, contained no fewer than 4 citadels. That was where Mordred's most powerful vessels had to be at the moment, no doubt. If he entrenched himself in Godgrave, his power would keep growing steadily, endlessly fueling his genocidal campaign against the human domain. Why is my brother so ambitious? Morgan smiled darkly. Her brother, Mordred, was like a mirror. The person who had reflected in it first was his father, Anvil of Valor, and the person who had reflected in it the most was his captor and guardian, Astarion. The wretched boy took the worst parts of both and combined them into one unholy persona. Perhaps it was a miracle that he had not slaughtered any cities before now. What is taking Kai so long? At this rate, they would not even be able to retreat. An orderly retreat was the most difficult of military maneuvers, after all. Some distance away, Kai cut down a powerful vessel of the King of Nothing and glanced around. No matter where he glanced, he saw no path to salvage the battle. There was only one thing he could do. So, Kai gritted his teeth, and then whispered. Astarion. His voice echoed above the battlefield. 2815 got out of the machine. As soon as Kai whispered the Dreamspawn's name, there was a subtle shift to the world. That shift was not something that could be seen or sensed, and yet every living thing on the bloody shores of the Lake of Tears had felt it. And somehow, all of them had the same thought when they did. They thought about Astarion, the Dreamspawn, invoking his name in their minds. And so, Astarion appeared among them. As if he had always been there, walking by their side. You've gotten yourself into quite the trouble, haven't you? Kai flinched and reeled away when a pleasant voice suddenly resounded from behind him. There, a tall man with golden eyes stood, untouched by the grime and chaos of the battle. His hands were folded behind his back, and a faint smile was playing on his lips. Kai regained his balance and glanced at the Dreamspawn with a guarded expression. Astarion chuckled. Why are you acting so surprised, young man? Didn't you call me yourself? Shaking his head, he took a few steps forward and glanced at the Lake of Tears, or Roos Sibley at the mirror gate that had subsumed its surface. If anyone should be surprised, it's me. I did not expect you to conjure me voluntarily. After all, you should have a good idea of what the consequences of this decision will be. Astarion gave Kai an amused smile, prompting him to grit his teeth. Of course, he knew. Despite how valiantly Kai and his warriors had fought, they were no match for the King of Nothing. Only a Supreme could contain another Supreme, and so, he had no choice but to call upon Astarion, if he wanted to save the settlers, at least. Astarion had promised to help, after all. However, his help was a poisoned chalice. Kai was going to have to forfeit the lives of the fleeing civilians and watch more of his soldiers die during the retreat, but if Astarion appeared like a god out of the machine, that dreadful outcome did not need to happen. The Dreamspawn could thwart Mordred and save everyone. But by doing so, he would become a savior in the eyes of every soldier on this terrible battlefield. The news of his benevolence and valor would spread far and wide, sowing seeds of the plague in the hearts of those who were still stalwart in their loyalty to the immortal flame. In fact, this news could very well become the last drop, It could deal a fatal attack to the longing domain, which was already wounded and nearly brought to its knees. Kai knew it all too well. But what else could he do? If Astarion triumphed today, there was still hope of defeating him tomorrow. But if Mordred won, the lives of countless people would be lost forever, just like the lives of all the people of Redhill had been lost forever. So, Kai had made a decision that left him with a bit of hope, at least. He chose to save as many people as he could today instead of sacrificing them for the sake of tomorrow. Even knowing that he could not have chosen differently, he was not at all sure that he had made the right choice. But there was no turning back. The Dreamspawn was like an evil djinn. Once he was out of the bottle, nothing could put him back into its prison. Kai exhaled slowly, as if you were ever going to let this citadel fall into Mordred's hands. In fact, Astarion could have appeared on this battlefield at any point. It was not like there were no thralls here who could call out his name. So why had he even waited for Kai to do it? It's because the call of a saint carries a special weight. Kai glanced at the Dreamspawn, who was not even hiding the fact that he was reading Kai's thoughts. It sounded reasonable, and yet, you're lying. Kai knew that the Dreamspawn had a different reason. Astarion remained silent for a moment, then chuckled. What a peculiar flaw. He studied Kai silently, then leaned forward and said with a pleasant smile. It's because I wanted to break you. You are one of Changing Star's most loyal companions, after all. So, I wanted you, and no one else, to call me. He leaned back again, his smile widening. And look, you aren't broken yet, but there is already a crack in your resolve. Kai's expression turned dark. All around them, the battle had come to a lull. The King of Nothing pulled back his forces, and the warriors of the human domain received a sudden respite. They leaned on their weapons, breathing heavily and looking at the sea of vessels with dark, smoldering wariness. Many had already noticed Astarion, looking at him with shock and wonder. Sparks of timid hope ignited in their eyes, and they hurried to relay the news of a supreme appearing to support them to their fellow soldiers. Astarion sighed, turned away from Kai, and headed toward the lake. As he did, he halted for a second and threw over his shoulder. I suggest you run. He continued on his way to the red waters of the Lake of TGS, paying no attention to Mordred's vessels that stood in his way. They parted in front of him, clearing a wide path to the shore. If you want to talk to me, boy, come face me. We haven't seen each other in so long, won't you come to greet your teacher properly, at least? Astarion was halfway to the lake when a new figure appeared on the shore, having stepped out of the mirror gate seconds earlier. It was a man with pale skin, dark hair, and two strange, mirror-like eyes. The King of Nothing and the Dreamspawn met on the shores of the Lake of Tears, surrounded by corpses and the stench of blood. Astarion studied Mordred for a while, then sighed and shook his head. I told you to face me. Did you think I would not recognize one of your reflections? Mordred grinned. In the next moment, his figure changed, turning into a perfect copy of Astarion himself. He chuckled, his golden eyes glowing in the sunlight, and offered the Dreamspawn a mocking bow. Why, did you expect me to come anywhere near you? Thanks, but no thanks. I prefer to be the only tenant in my own head. Mordred looked Astarion over. Greetings, teacher. When did you get so old?